To understand the Merovingians is to step into a world caught between myth and history, where the boundaries of reality are blurred and the very idea of kingship is entwined with mystery. The Merovingians were no ordinary dynasty. Long before the Carolingians would rise to dominate Europe, long before the names of Charlemagne or Pepin would echo through history, there existed a line of rulers whose blood was considered sacred, whose authority was as much spiritual as it was temporal, and whose origins are shrouded in both legend and deliberate secrecy. The story begins with Merovec, a figure suspended between the tangible record of history and the misty realm of myth. Chroniclers of the time, most notably Gregory of Tours, offer tantalizing glimpses into his life, yet the details are fragmented, inconsistent, and often veiled in allegory. Merovec is said to have been conceived under extraordinary circumstances, a union between a mortal queen and a mysterious sea creature. While the literal truth of such a claim is impossible to verify, the persistence of the story across generations speaks volumes. It is a tale designed to imbue the Merovingian line with an aura of the otherworldly, signaling that from its very inception, this dynasty would not be ordinary. In an age where divine sanction was everything, such an origin story was a powerful tool, positioning the Merovingians as rulers not merely by conquest or inheritance, but by destiny itself. The seaborne myth is more than just fanciful storytelling. In Northern European culture, water was often associated with the sacred, the liminal spaces where the divine could intersect with the mortal. Rivers, lakes, and oceans were not merely geographic features, but portals to the unknown. The notion that Merovec's blood carried the mark of such a union implies a connection to forces beyond human comprehension, a sacred lineage capable of influencing events in ways that others could not. By invoking this origin, the Merovingians were effectively claiming legitimacy that no mortal authority could challenge, a claim that would echo through centuries of European politics and legend. Following Merovec, the dynasty moved into the historical realm through his descendants. Childeric I, his son, was a formidable figure whose legacy bridges the semi-mythical world of his father with the emerging historical records of the Franks. Archaeological evidence from Childeric's tomb, discovered in the 17th century near Tournai, reveals treasures that hint at the dynasty's wealth, influence, and ritual sophistication. Gold bees, ornate weaponry, and jewelry were buried alongside him, not simply as markers of status, but as symbols with deeper significance. The bees, later adopted by Napoleon centuries after, may have originally served as emblems of immortality, order, and sacred kingship, signaling that the Merovingians' authority was intertwined with both divine favor and cultural memory. Childeric's reign established the Merovingians as a political and military force. His prowess on the battlefield, combined with his ability to unite disparate Frankish tribes, laid the groundwork for his son, Clovis, who would elevate the dynasty to unprecedented prominence. Yet the Merovingians were careful to maintain a mystique around their rule. Authority was expressed not only through force of arms, but through ritual, symbolism, and the careful cultivation of myth. Kings were more than leaders. They were embodiments of sacred law, intermediaries between humanity and the divine. Their actions, their appearance, even their hair, long and flowing, untouched by barbers, and a visible symbol of divine favor, carried meaning far beyond the mundane. To cut a Merovingian's hair was not merely an act of humiliation. It was an attack on the spiritual essence that legitimized their rule. Clovis, son of Childeric, stands as a pivotal figure in the dynasty's history. A warrior and shrewd strategist, he united the Frankish tribes under a single crown, dramatically reshaping the political landscape of Gaul. Yet his ascent was not only a story of conquest, it was also a story of cunning and divine manipulation. By embracing Christianity, Clovis aligned himself with the Church, securing not only the loyalty of his people, but the spiritual sanction that lent his reign unassailable legitimacy. This act, however, did not erase the older, northern traditions from which the Merovingians emerged. Evidence suggests that pagan rites and sacred rituals persisted alongside Christianity, their meaning veiled, but their influence enduring. The dynasty's power was thus dual. It drew from both the new religious order and the older, secretive northern cosmologies, blending them in a way that few rivals could contest. The sacred aspect of Merovingian rule is crucial to understanding their mystique. Chroniclers often hint at extraordinary abilities: kings who could heal the sick with a touch, rulers who possessed prophetic insight, and ceremonies that transcended ordinary religious observance. These accounts suggest a worldview in which the king's authority was not merely political, but metaphysical, derived from an unbroken chain of sacred inheritance. The Merovingians were as much priestly figures as monarchs, and their rituals, ceremonies, and public appearances were carefully designed to reinforce this perception. Long hair, consecrated symbols, and even their manner of procession communicated to the people that they were in the presence of the sacred. Artifacts from the Merovingian period further reinforce this understanding. Gold bees, intricate jewelry, and ceremonial weaponry are not just decorative items. They carry meaning. Bees, as emblems, symbolize diligence, immortality, and sacred order. Serpents, another recurring motif, suggest wisdom, hidden knowledge, and guardianship of secrets. These symbols, visible to those who could read them, reinforce the idea that the Merovingians were not simply rulers of land and people, but custodians of a hidden, mystical power. This visual language of authority extended beyond the written word, speaking directly to the subconscious understanding of the people and the elite alike. The merging of myth, ritual, and political power is also evident in the treatment of succession. Unlike many dynasties that relied solely on primogeniture, the Merovingians' legitimacy was intertwined with ritual and symbolism. The sacred right to rule could not be granted merely by inheritance. It had to be affirmed through ceremonies that connected the king to divine and ancestral forces. In this way, the Merovingians reinforced their authority not only through political means, but through carefully maintained spiritual traditions, blending northern pagan motifs with emerging Christian symbolism. Even after Clovis, the Merovingian dynasty faced the challenges of maintaining authority amidst external threats and internal rivalries. The rise of the Carolingians would eventually eclipse them politically, yet the aura of the Merovingians remained. The church, wary of their spiritual authority, and rivals, fearful of their sacred blood, sought to diminish their power. Chroniclers labeled later Merovingian kings as Roisfanians, do-nothing kings, attempting to portray the dynasty as ceremonial figureheads. Yet beneath this public narrative, the Merovingians' sacred lineage and secret knowledge continued to exert influence, suggesting that power is not always visible on the battlefield or recorded in official decrees. The persistence of the Merovingians' mystique points to a broader truth about history, that the stories we inherit are often filtered through the agendas of those who record them. Propaganda, censorship, and selective memory shape our understanding of the past. In the case of the Merovingians, what survives in chronicles and artifacts is only part of a larger narrative, one that intertwines myth, ritual, sacred symbols, and political power. The dynasty's origins, steeped in legend and mystery, invite us to look beyond conventional history and consider the forces, mystical, symbolic, and hidden, that shaped their reign. Moreover, the Merovingians' northern connections cannot be overlooked. The myths surrounding Meroveca's conception, the ritual use of symbols like bees and serpents, and the emphasis on sacred blood suggest links to northern European traditions, particularly Scandinavian beliefs in sacred kingship and divine ancestry. These connections hint at a continuity of spiritual and political thought stretching across regions and centuries, suggesting that the Merovingians were part of a wider cultural and mystical network whose influence reached far beyond Gaul. In many ways, the Merovingians represent a fusion of worlds, pagan and Christian, northern and southern, myth and history. Their story challenges conventional narratives, demanding that we consider kingship as more than a matter of land, armies, or treaties. It is about perception, ritual, sacred inheritance, and the deliberate cultivation of mystery. The dynasty's power was encoded in their blood, their symbols, and their ceremonies, a power that could survive political defeats and the erasure attempts of rival factions. The origins of the Merovingians also underscore a central theme in understanding European history, that dynasties often wield power in ways that transcend the visible. Myth, legend, and sacred symbolism are not trivial. They are instruments of authority, shaping societies, reinforcing legitimacy, and preserving secrets across generations. By claiming descent from a semi-divine ancestor, by employing symbolic artifacts, and by maintaining rituals that affirmed their sacred status, the Merovingians established a framework of authority that was resilient, complex, and enduring. Even today, the aura of the Merovingians captivates scholars, historians, and enthusiasts of esoteric history. The combination of historical evidence, mythic narrative, and symbolic ritual creates a tapestry that is as compelling as it is enigmatic. Their story invites questions about the nature of power, the relationship between myth and reality, and the ways in which sacred authority can shape human history. Ultimately, the origins of the Merovingians are a reminder that history is not merely a record of events. It is a narrative shaped by belief, ritual, and perception. Kings were not just rulers of land. They were custodians of sacred knowledge, embodiments of mystical traditions, and living symbols of a power that transcended time. The Merovingians' bloodline, born of legend and preserved through ritual, offers a window into a world where the divine, the political, and the mysterious converge, and where the past continues to speak through whispers, symbols, and the enduring legacy of a dynasty unlike any other. To truly understand the Merovingians, one must first step into a world on the edge of transformation, a Europe where the old Roman order was collapsing and new powers were rising from its ruins. The Franks were a confederation of tribes, wandering warriors, and farmers who had once been shadows at the fringes of history. By the 5th century, they had begun to consolidate under a king whose name would become both legendary and elusive, Clovis. Yet before Clovis, there was Merovec, the semi-mythical founder of the dynasty, a figure whose life straddles the line between history and legend, whose origins are as mysterious as the northern seas themselves. Merovec's story is fragmentary, pieced together from chronicles written decades, sometimes centuries, after the events themselves. Gregory of Tours, the primary historian of early Frankish kings, offers glimpses of Merovec's reign, but often hesitates, almost as if the truth of his origins were too dangerous to record fully. According to legend, Merovec was conceived in a union between his mother and a mysterious sea creature, an event that imbued his descendants with a sacred aura. Whether myth or reality, this story reveals much about how the Merovingians understood power. It was not merely political, but divine. Their authority came from forces beyond human comprehension. It was this claim that set them apart from other rulers of their time. Following Merovec came Childeric I, his son, a formidable warrior and cunning strategist whose tomb, discovered centuries later in Tournai, revealed treasures that spoke of a culture both sophisticated and enigmatic. Among his grave goods were gold bees, ornate weaponry, and jewelry that seemed to signal a royal status imbued with sacred meaning. These were not simple tokens of wealth. They were symbols of continuity, a deliberate assertion that this bloodline carried something extraordinary. The bees, in particular, would become emblematic of the Merovingians' secretive majesty, a motif later used by the Napoleonic Empire, yet whose roots reach back into the shadows of early medieval Gaul. It was Childeric's son, Clovis, who would cement the dynasty's historical prominence. Clovis was a warrior of ambition and a ruler of vision, uniting the Frankish tribes under a single crown. Yet his reign was not only a story of conquest, it was a story of conversion and cunning. By embracing Christianity, Clovis secured the support of the Church, aligning his kingship with divine sanction in the eyes of the wider Roman world. Yet even in this alliance, the Merovingian aura remained intact. The dynasty did not merely inherit thrones. It inherited a sense of destiny that transcended mortal kingship. Clovis and his successors wielded power as both warriors and sacred intermediaries, their authority validated as much by myth and ritual as by law or battle. But the Merovingian court was far from a purely Christian establishment. Scholars note the persistence of older rites, hints of pagan ceremonies, and secret practices that survived the Christianization of the Franks. Chroniclers wrote cautiously, often hinting at strange behaviors or mystical powers, but without the clarity to explain them. Some accounts describe kings with the ability to heal the sick with a touch, or to foresee events with uncanny accuracy. Others speak of unusual rituals surrounding royal succession, particularly the significance of long hair, which was seen as a visible channel of divine favor. Cut a Merovingian's hair, and you stripped him not just of status, but of spiritual potency. Even more intriguing were the tales whispered in monasteries and among scribes, that the Merovingians carried a secret knowledge, an understanding of the sacred forces that govern the world. It was this knowledge, perhaps more than their conquests, that made them both respected and feared. The dynasty's very existence challenged the emerging order of the Church and the new political structures, suggesting that kingship was not granted solely by God in heaven or Pope in Rome, but through an older, northern lineage, a bloodline that predated the empire and even the Church itself. By the time Clovis passed from history, the Merovingians had established a precedent that would ripple through centuries. The idea that royal blood could carry power beyond mere politics, that myths could legitimize dynasties, and that the right to rule could be inherited not only through law, but through something far more ancient and mystical. Their legacy, however, was fragile. The rise of the Carolingians would see the Merovingians' political influence wane, their power curtailed, and their secrets buried beneath layers of propaganda and revisionist history. Yet even in decline, their aura persisted. Chroniclers, wary of their reputation and wary of truth, left fragments of tales that hinted at a line of kings who were unlike any others, rulers whose blood was, in the eyes of their contemporaries, something both terrifying and sacred. As we trace the Merovingians through the annals of history, we begin to see a pattern, a dynasty that walks the line between man and myth, whose kingship is inseparable from legend, and whose story cannot be contained within the simple chronology of wars and treaties. These were rulers whose very existence provoked awe, suspicion, and sometimes fear. Theirs was a world where the sacred and the political were inseparable, where myth informed governance, and where the blood flowing through the veins of a king carried more weight than armies or alliances. The Merovingians remind us that history is rarely the full story. Behind the dates, the battles, and the alliances, there are echoes of a deeper truth, that some lines of power are eternal, and some blood refuses to be forgotten. Their story invites us to question what we accept as historical fact, to peer into the space where legend and record intersect, and to wonder whether the kings of the Franks were truly of this world, or whether, in some hidden sense, they were born to rule across the realms of men and gods alike. Legends are often born where the edge of the known world meets the unknown, and few are more compelling than the tale of Merovec, the semi-mythical progenitor of the Merovingian dynasty. The story is strange, almost impossible to accept at face value, yet persisted in the chronicles of the Franks and the whispers of neighboring peoples. According to tradition, Meroveca's mother, a noblewoman of high rank, became pregnant under circumstances that defied ordinary explanation. She was said to have encountered a mysterious creature from the sea, a being of immense power, neither wholly human nor entirely divine. From this union, Merovec was born, a child destined to bridge the worlds of mortal men and sacred entities. In the context of early European myth, the story is not as singular as it first appears. The northern seas, with their violent storms and hidden depths, were long regarded as the domain of gods and spirits. Scandinavian sagas are filled with accounts of sea kings, divine mariners, and otherworldly beings who emerged from water to influence human destiny. These beings were not always benevolent. They were unpredictable, powerful, and capable of bestowing greatness or disaster upon those who crossed their paths. In this light, the tale of Meroveca's conception begins to take on a wider resonance, suggesting that the Merovingians were aligning themselves with a northern cosmology in which the sea itself was a source of authority and sacred blood. The symbolism is multi-layered. Water, in these myths, is both life and death, creation and destruction. By linking Meroveca's birth to the sea, chroniclers, whether intentionally or not, framed the Merovingians as a dynasty with origins beyond the ordinary realm of men. This was not merely an assertion of divine favor. It was a declaration of a unique inheritance, one that could not be replicated or challenged easily. The Franks, a people rising from the chaos of a post-Roman world, were offered a king whose legitimacy flowed from sources ancient and untouchable, sources that even the church would later struggle to suppress. But the sea-born motif is only one element of a broader northern narrative. Across Scandinavia, early Norse myths recount children of gods and humans who became kings, heroes, or seers. Odin himself, the All-Father, was said to have sired mortal lines that would carry his wisdom and power across generations. These myths emphasize the idea that royal blood is sacred and often supernatural, a conduit for the divine in human affairs. The parallels with the Merovingian legends are striking: a northern lineage, a divine or semi-divine progenitor, and a claim to rule that transcends ordinary authority. Scholars and theorists alike have noted that the Merovingians' claim was not a local curiosity, but part of a wider tapestry of northern European beliefs in sacred kingship. The story of Meroveca's conception also served as political theater. In an era when kingship was fragile and contested, extraordinary origin stories were more than mythology. They were instruments of legitimacy. To the common people, these tales were awe-inspiring. To rivals, they were a warning. The Merovingians were not mere men. They were touched by forces that defied comprehension. This aura of the extraordinary reinforced their rule in the early Frankish territories, lending weight to their decrees and commanding loyalty through fear, reverence, and fascination. Beyond myth and politics, there is evidence of enduring symbols connecting the Merovingians to the north. Artifacts discovered in graves and ritual sites, golden bees, serpent motifs, and ornate weaponry echo Scandinavian symbolism of kingship and divine ancestry. The bee, a creature of resurrection and meticulous order, and the serpent, a guardian of hidden knowledge, appear in both Frankish and northern contexts. These symbols suggest that the Merovingians were consciously drawing upon an older northern mythology to solidify their claim, creating a cultural continuity between ancient Scandinavia and early medieval Gaul. The sea, then, becomes more than a mere backdrop. It is the origin of power, the source of a bloodline that is both human and divine. The Merovingians, by invoking this myth, positioned themselves as heirs not just to territory, but to a sacred order that had existed long before the rise of the Franks. This was a dynasty that claimed a metaphysical inheritance, a lineage that carried within it the memory of northern kings, heroes, and gods. Even as historians sought to rationalize these tales, the power of the myth endured, hinting at truths buried beneath layers of legend and propaganda. The Viking myth also reminds us that the boundaries between history and storytelling were fluid in the early medieval world. Fact and myth intertwined to create authority. Belief became legitimacy, and the supernatural was an active player in human politics. The Merovingians were more than conquerors. They were the embodiment of northern mystery, a living bridge between the mortal realm and forces beyond. Their blood, it was said, carried a secret, a power that could not be fully understood or contained. As we look closer at the connection between the Franks and their northern neighbors, the myth's resonance deepens. The stories of sea-born kings in Scandinavia, of Odin's mortal descendants, and of sacred bloodlines converge with the Merovingian legend. This intersection suggests not coincidence, but design, a deliberate fusion of myth, memory, and political authority. The Merovingians were claiming not just lands or titles, but a sacred inheritance from the very heart of the North, asserting a continuity of divine rulership that stretched across centuries and regions. In the end, the Viking myth is more than a tale of fantastical origins. It is a window into how the Merovingians understood themselves and how they sought to be remembered. It is a story that asks us to reconsider the boundaries of history, to look beyond dates and battles, and to recognize that sometimes the true power of kings lies not in their armies or crowns, but in the stories they carry, stories that link them to gods, to the elements, and to a hidden northern legacy that refuses to be forgotten. Long before the thunder of Viking longships echoed across northern seas, Scandinavia was already a land of mystery, ritual, and powerful lineages whose stories would later ripple into European history. The frozen forests, jagged fjords, and windswept plains of the north were more than a backdrop for survival. They were a crucible for culture, mythology, and governance. Tribal chieftains ruled not merely through force, but through sacred authority, a power believed to flow from divine or ancestral blood. In these early kingdoms, kingship was inseparable from spirituality, and the rituals surrounding succession and sovereignty were as vital as any army. Archaeological evidence reveals that Bronze Age Scandinavia was a landscape steeped in symbolism and ceremonial importance. Burial mounds rose like hills of memory across the land, marking the resting places of individuals whose status was extraordinary. Within these mounds, archaeologists have uncovered weapons, jewelry, and artifacts that suggest an elite class whose wealth and influence were intertwined with religious authority. Sun motifs, serpent carvings, and enigmatic geometric designs hint at a culture deeply attuned to the cycles of nature, the cosmos, and the unseen forces that governed existence. These sacred patterns were not mere decoration. They were language, a code of power, passed down through generations, recognized by those initiated into the ways of the elite. Kings of this early period were often considered intermediaries between the human and divine realms. Oral traditions, preserved in sagas and later recorded in the medieval period, describe rulers with extraordinary abilities, seers who could interpret omens, warriors whose prowess seemed guided by supernatural forces, and kings whose authority was validated by ritual rather than conquest alone. These leaders were expected to perform sacred duties, offerings to deities, maintenance of cosmic order through ceremonies, and oversight of societal laws that bound communities together. The legitimacy of rule depended not only on birthright, but on the ability to maintain the invisible threads linking the people to the sacred. The connection to the divine was often symbolized through material culture. Long before the Merovingians adopted the bee as a royal emblem, northern elites employed symbols that conveyed both authority and mystical protection. Serpents, birds of prey, and solar discs appear frequently on artifacts, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of the symbolic language of power. These emblems were recognized across regions, reinforcing the idea that certain families held a sacred status that transcended ordinary tribal boundaries. Power, in this sense, was encoded in bloodlines and the ritual observances that reinforced their sacred authority. Trade and migration further strengthened these elite networks. Northern Scandinavia, while remote, was far from isolated. Rivers, fjords, and early maritime routes connected the region to the British Isles, the Baltic, and continental Europe. Precious metals, amber, and exotic goods circulated among elite families, facilitating alliances and consolidating influence. These exchanges were not merely economic. They were also cultural and symbolic, transmitting the sacred knowledge, rituals, and myths that underpin the legitimacy of ruling dynasties. It is in this context that we begin to see the early seeds of what would later influence the Merovingian claims to sacred northern heritage. The idea of sacred kingship in Scandinavia was inseparable from landscape and ritual. Sacred groves, stone circles, and burial mounds were focal points of power, places where the divine and the human intersected. Leaders were expected to maintain these sites, oversee ceremonies, and ensure the continuity of their line through careful succession. Failure to uphold these responsibilities could result in social collapse, natural disaster, or divine retribution. A belief system that underscored the weight of blood and lineage in maintaining cosmic and social order. It is within this framework of sacred authority that the potential connections to the Merovingians emerge. While Gaul and Northern Europe may seem distant from the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, the cultural threads are unmistakable. The northern obsession with bloodlines, ritual, and sacred kingship mirrors the practices and symbols associated with the Merovingians. Their claims of divine ancestry, strange rituals, and the enigmatic power of their blood may not have been merely local innovations, but inherited echoes of older northern traditions. The Merovingians, then, could be seen as part of a continuum, a dynasty whose roots extended into the hidden royal structures of the north, before the rise of Viking fame and before the continent fully embraced Christianity. This hidden royal legacy also invites us to reconsider the nature of European history itself. Much of what survives in written form is filtered through the lens of conquest, religion, and politics. Yet beneath these records lies a substratum of culture and belief, carried through generations, that shaped the legitimacy and identity of rulers across the continent. The northern elites, with their sacred symbols, elaborate rituals, and belief in blood as a conduit of divine authority, laid the foundation for ideas that would later surface in the courts of the Franks, the Merovingians, and perhaps even beyond. In these landscapes of frozen rivers and misted forests, one can almost hear the echoes of a time when kings were chosen not merely for strength or strategy, but for their connection to forces unseen. It is a world where the sacred and the political were inseparable, where blood was memory, and where the seeds of dynastic power were nurtured in silence and ritual long before they entered the written chronicles of Europe. Understanding Scandinavia before the Viking Age is crucial to seeing the Merovingians not as isolated anomalies, but as heirs to a northern royal tradition whose hidden legacy traveled across time, geography, and mythology, influencing the course of European history in ways we are only beginning to perceive. Throughout history, symbols have served as more than mere decoration. They are language, encoded with meaning, power, and authority. For the Merovingians, this language of symbols was central to their identity, both as rulers and as guardians of secretive heritage. Among the most striking of these emblems are the bee and the serpent. creatures whose presence in royal iconography was deliberate, mysterious, and laden with layers of meaning. These symbols were not randomly chosen. They spoke to the very essence of what it meant to rule, to protect sacred knowledge, and to assert a lineage that transcended ordinary human authority. The bee, often appearing in Merovingian artifacts, jewelry, and ceremonial regalia, represents order, productivity, and immortality. In an era when life was harsh and survival precarious, the bee was an emblem of civilization itself, a creature whose labor sustains the community, whose society is organized with precision, and whose existence mirrors the cycles of nature. More than this, in esoteric traditions, the bee symbolizes resurrection and continuity. By adopting the bee as a royal emblem, the Merovingians were not simply appealing to natural metaphors. They were claiming a sacred continuity, positioning their bloodline as a hive of order and divine purpose. The bee becomes, therefore, a visual assertion of their eternal relevance and sacred right to rule. In contrast, the serpent carries a more complex and enigmatic meaning. Across ancient Europe and into Scandinavia, serpents were often associated with wisdom, guardianship, and the hidden currents of power. They are creatures of the earth and the underworld, moving unseen, observing the cycles of life, and guarding secrets too dangerous for ordinary eyes. In Merovingian symbolism, the serpent is intertwined with the notion of esoteric knowledge, that the rulers were not only kings but also keepers of truths that could alter the course of history. Like the serpent, their authority was subtle yet formidable, flowing beneath the surface, invisible to the uninitiated, yet profoundly effective in shaping events. Together, the bee and the serpent create a duality that mirrors the Merovingian conception of power. The bee embodies visible authority, societal order, and productive rule, while the serpent embodies hidden knowledge, spiritual insight, and secret influence. This dual symbolism suggests that Merovingian kingship was never intended to be purely political. It was sacred, holistic, and carefully structured, balancing what could be seen by the masses with what was preserved in secrecy for the elite and the initiates. Their power was therefore both public and private, ceremonial and mystical, human and divine. Evidence of these symbols appears across artifacts and archaeological findings. Gold bees have been discovered in Merovingian graves, often alongside swords, combs, and ceremonial regalia, hinting at their role not just as adornment, but as markers of sacred kingship. Serpent motifs appear in carvings, jewelry, and illuminated manuscripts, sometimes paired with other enigmatic symbols like the sun or the tree of life. These recurring patterns suggest a conscious effort to encode a lineage of power and knowledge, a visual language that communicates authority to those who understand it, while remaining inscrutable to outsiders. The significance of these symbols extends beyond mere representation. They are ritualistic and performative. Historical accounts hint that Merovingian kings performed ceremonies where such symbols played a central role, in coronations, sacred oaths, or rites of healing. The bee, with its connotations of resurrection, may have been invoked in rituals affirming the continuity of the royal line, while the serpent could symbolize protection of sacred knowledge and the unseen forces that legitimize their rule. The consistent use of these symbols across generations indicates that the Merovingians were deeply aware of the power of visual language to communicate both legitimacy and esoteric authority. Interestingly, parallels to these symbols can be found in Scandinavia and Northern Europe, where the Merovingians' supposed ancestral homelands lie. Serpents and bees, along with similar creatures and patterns, appear in Bronze Age carvings, runestones, and burial artifacts, suggesting a shared symbolic tradition across northern cultures. This implies that the Merovingians' use of the bee and serpent was not isolated, but connected to a larger northern ethos, a continuum of sacred kingship that stretched from the fjords of Scandinavia to the river valleys of Gaul. By adopting these emblems, the Merovingians were not inventing a new identity. They were consciously aligning themselves with an ancient cross-generational narrative of power, blood, and divine legitimacy. The bee and the serpent also speak to the broader Merovingian obsession with secrecy and selective knowledge. Just as the serpent moves unseen, and the bee communicates with its own kind through intricate dances and signals, so too did the Merovingians maintain a hierarchy of knowledge. What was visible to the public, what was known only to the court, and what remained hidden even from most of their closest advisors. This duality of exposure and concealment reinforced the mystique of the dynasty, ensuring that their authority was never purely political, but entwined with an aura of sacred, almost supernatural influence. Through these symbols, we begin to glimpse the deeper philosophy of Merovingian rule. Kingship was not just a matter of conquest or inheritance. It was an embodiment of continuity, wisdom, and sacred responsibility. Each emblem, each ritual, each carefully preserved artifact reinforced the message that the Merovingians were different, that their blood carried memory, their lineage carried power, and their reigns were governed as much by unseen forces as by human law. By decoding the language of the bee and the serpent, we uncover the Merovingians' subtle strategy to rule not just through force or decree, but through the perception of sacred authority, through the suggestion that they were heirs to mysteries older than kingdoms, older than Christendom, older even than the lands they ruled. In this way, the dynasty positioned itself at the intersection of the visible and invisible worlds, a living embodiment of northern myth and sacred tradition, a bloodline that would forever leave traces of its power in both history and legend. In the cold, windswept reaches of northern Europe, the concept of sacred blood was not a metaphor, but a living reality. Among the Norse, kings and chieftains often claimed descent from the gods themselves, a lineage that conferred authority, prestige, and a sense of destiny that transcended mere mortality. The Merovingians, though centered in the heart of Gaul, seem to have adopted a parallel philosophy, linking themselves to divine or semi-divine origins in a way that mirrors these northern traditions. To understand the Merovingian self-perception, it is necessary to trace the concept of sacred blood from the fjords of Scandinavia to the royal courts of early medieval France, following a thread that runs through myth, genealogy, and the politics of legitimacy. The Norse believed that Odin, the All-Father, sired mortal lines that would carry his wisdom, courage, and spiritual power across generations. These descendants were not merely rulers. They were living conduits of divine will, intermediaries between the mortal world and the realms of the gods. Kingship in this context was both a privilege and a sacred duty, demanding not only the skills of leadership, but also the moral and spiritual integrity to uphold cosmic order. The Merovingians, through the tale of Meroveca's semi-divine conception and their subsequent rituals, seem to have embraced a remarkably similar model. Their claim was not to ordinary power, but to a bloodline sanctified by forces that predated human law, echoing the northern belief in dynasties guided by divine ancestry. Chroniclers of the Frankish courts often hint at these extraordinary qualities in Merovingian rulers. They describe kings whose touch could heal the sick, whose insight into human behavior bordered on the prophetic, and whose very presence seemed to command respect and awe. Such abilities were not merely personal traits, but were tied intrinsically to their lineage, a belief that royal blood carried inherent power, a spiritual potency inherited from one's forebears. This aligns closely with Norse traditions, where the divine essence of gods flowed into human heirs, ensuring that those of sacred descent were marked for greatness. The parallels deepen when we consider the symbols, rituals, and regalia associated with Merovingian kings. Long hair, the bee, and the serpent were not ornamental choices. They were codified expressions of sacred lineage and spiritual authority. Among the Norse, similar motifs appear in artifacts and sagas. Serpents guarding treasures or sacred trees, symbols of regeneration, protection, and secret wisdom. Both cultures appear to have understood that rulership was more than political office. It was a performance of cosmic significance, validated by blood, ritual, and symbol. The Merovingians' northern-inspired iconography thus signals a deliberate alignment with these ancient, sacred traditions. Perhaps the most striking example of this sacred continuity is the story of Dagobert II, often considered the last true Merovingian king in the historical line. His assassination and subsequent veneration in later legends suggest that he was regarded as more than a mere temporal ruler. In the esoteric traditions that emerged centuries later, Dagobert is portrayed as a custodian of secrets, a king whose bloodline embodied the sacred knowledge of generations. The echoes of Odin's mortal descendants are clear. Dagobert and his ancestors were not just political figures. They were the bearers of a divine mandate, living bridges between heaven and earth, north and south, myth and history. This sense of inherited sacred power was also reinforced by marriage alliances, fosterage, and ceremonial practices designed to preserve the purity and potency of the bloodline. Just as Norse rulers would marry within specific lineages to maintain divine connection, the Merovingians appear to have been conscious of the importance of ancestry. Legends hint at intermarriage among noble and possibly semi-divine lines, rituals to bless heirs, and rites designed to awaken latent powers within royal descendants. These practices, though obscured by centuries of rewriting and Christianization, indicate that the Merovingians were deeply invested in maintaining their sacred identity, not merely their political dominion. Beyond lineage, the Merovingians' sacred conception narrative itself serves as a bridge between northern mythology and their political reality. The story of Meroveca's semi-divine father parallels the Norse idea of gods mating with mortals to create extraordinary offspring. These narratives served both to inspire the populace and to legitimize the ruling class. In a time when the written record was sparse and the church's authority growing, myth became a tool for survival, a method of asserting power that was at once spiritual, political, and cultural. It reinforced the idea that the Merovingians were exceptional, chosen by forces beyond ordinary comprehension, and therefore entitled to rule. This blending of divine ancestry, ritual, and political necessity demonstrates the sophistication of early Merovingian ideology. It was not enough to win battles or inherit land. True legitimacy required the aura of sacred descent, the visible markers of power, and the secrecy of esoteric knowledge. The dynasty's strength lay not merely in its military or administrative abilities, but in its capacity to claim and embody a transcendent authority. In this sense, the Merovingians were both heirs and innovators, synthesizing northern mythological motifs with Frankish politics to craft a uniquely potent vision of kingship. By tracing these threads from Odin to Dagobert, we begin to see a continuum, a northern legacy of sacred bloodlines carried across generations, adapted to new lands and political realities, yet always retaining a mystical core. The Merovingians, in embracing this tradition, positioned themselves as more than rulers. They became living symbols of a cosmic order, bearers of a secret knowledge that intertwined with the very essence of Europe's northern heritage. It is this connection between myth, blood, and power that sets the Merovingians apart from other dynasties, revealing a lineage whose influence resonates long after their political dominion faded. As the Merovingians' sacred authority grew, so too did the unease of those who sought to control history, religion, and power. The early church, expanding its influence across Gaul, viewed the dynasty with a mixture of reverence, fear, and suspicion. Here were kings whose authority did not originate solely from papal blessing, but from an older, pre-Christian source, a lineage sanctified by myth, ritual, and sacred blood. This presented a challenge. How could the church consolidate control over a people whose rulers claimed divine right beyond the church's reach? The tension between the Merovingians and the ecclesiastical hierarchy would shape much of their story, giving rise to chronicles filled with careful omissions, half-truths, and cryptic warnings. Priests and monks who witnessed the rituals of the Merovingians often wrote with hesitation, hinting at practices they did not fully understand. Gregory of Tours, perhaps the most famous chronicler of the time, records kings whose presence could heal, whose insight verged on prophecy, and whose lineage seemed touched by forces beyond the human. Yet he rarely elaborates, as though aware that writing too plainly could provoke scandal, or worse, conflict with powerful bloodlines. In monasteries across Gaul, whispers circulated of ceremonies shrouded in secrecy, the sacred cutting of hair, rites of anointment that went beyond the Christian sacrament, and blessings meant to channel a mystical inheritance. These were not public acts. They were displays of power reserved for those initiated into the mysteries of the dynasty. The church's unease was not merely theoretical. The Merovingians' spiritual authority undermined the emerging ecclesiastical hierarchy. Kings who claimed divine blood could resist clerical dictates. They could validate their rule independently of Rome. In some cases, the church responded with subtle coercion, in others with outright propaganda. Chroniclers described certain kings as weak or ineffectual, the so-called Roisfanians, or do-nothing kings. Some historians argue that this label was deliberate, a tool to diminish the Merovingians' political legitimacy while obscuring the real reason for ecclesiastical concern, namely, the dynasty's access to sacred knowledge and unmediated divine authority. But the tension was not one-sided. The Merovingians were not naive in their dealings with the church. They understood the power of symbols, ritual, and belief, and they employed these to maintain their authority. Coronations were carefully orchestrated to demonstrate sacred lineage. Royal gestures, words, and insignia were imbued with meaning meant to convey legitimacy both to the populace and to skeptical clerics. In this interplay of politics and religion, the Merovingians walked a delicate line, asserting their sacred right while negotiating with a church that sought to rewrite the rules of kingship. The priests who served in the Merovingian court found themselves in a precarious position. Some were allies, preserving knowledge and guiding rituals, while others were observers, recording events with veiled language that hints at their unease. These men, scribes, monks, and clerics, often knew too much. They saw the sacred rites, understood the symbolism, and recognized the dynasty's claims to pre-Christian authority. Yet their records are fragmented, cryptic, and occasionally contradictory, suggesting a careful attempt to reveal truth without inciting condemnation. In this way, the Merovingians' sacred bloodline remained partially hidden, even in the written record, preserved only in fragments for those willing to read between the lines. This duality, of secrecy and revelation, of sacred knowledge both guarded and observed, reinforces the sense that the Merovingians were more than mere rulers. They were custodians of a tradition older than the church itself, a lineage that carried power in its blood and authority in its rituals. The church, aware of the implications, sought to suppress or reinterpret these practices, framing them as superstition or eccentricity. But attempts at erasure could never fully succeed. The sacred knowledge persisted, veiled in symbolism, ritual, and myth. The tension between the Merovingians and the church also speaks to a broader theme: the struggle between institutional authority and inherited sacred power. In claiming a divine or semi-divine lineage, the dynasty challenged the monopoly of the church over spiritual legitimacy. This struggle echoes through history, a reminder that knowledge, belief, and authority are deeply intertwined. The Merovingians' power was not merely in their armies or lands, but in their ability to command awe, inspire reverence, and embody traditions that the church could neither fully embrace nor entirely suppress. Ultimately, the priests who knew too much serve as witnesses to a hidden world, a world in which kingship was sacred, knowledge was guarded, and bloodlines carried secrets beyond mortal understanding. Their writings, cautious yet revealing, allow modern observers to glimpse the complexity of Merovingian rule, a dynasty whose power rested as much in myth, ritual, and sacred heritage as it did in conquest. It is within these quiet observations, these veiled chronicles, that we begin to understand why the Merovingians were feared, respected, and ultimately targeted by forces determined to reshape history and suppress the legacy of a bloodline that was anything but ordinary. Among the many legends that surround the Merovingians, few are as enduring or as tantalizing as the connection to the Holy Grail. Long before it became a staple of medieval romance, the Grail was whispered about as a vessel of divine power, a symbol of sacred blood, and a key to mysteries that the Church sought to contain. In some esoteric traditions, the Grail was not merely a cup, but a metaphor for a bloodline, a living lineage that carried the essence of divine authority from generation to generation. For the Merovingians, this connection was more than symbolic. It was a claim to a continuity of sacred power that transcended both time and the reach of earthly rulers. The story begins with the suggestion that the Merovingians were descended from a union of the mortal and the divine. Meroveca's semi-mythical conception by a sea creature, already entwined with northern symbolism, created a lineage that was both human and supernatural. Within this framework, the Grail takes on new meaning. It is not an artifact to be sought in a distant castle, but a vessel carried in the blood, encoded in the very veins of the dynasty. This interpretation reframes centuries of Grail legends, suggesting that the quest for the cup may have been, in part, a quest to protect, recognize, or understand a sacred bloodline whose secrecy was essential to its survival. Medieval chroniclers and later esoteric writers hint at this connection through subtle references. Texts speak of kings with healing powers, of blood that grants life or wisdom, and of relics preserved in secrecy. Some Grail romances describe rulers whose legitimacy is tied to hidden knowledge and divine ancestry, descriptions that echo the Merovingians' reputed abilities. It is as if the Grail stories themselves were veiled retellings of a historical truth, encoded in allegory to survive centuries of religious and political censorship. The symbolism of the Grail intertwines seamlessly with northern myths of sacred kingship. Just as Odin's descendants were believed to inherit wisdom and power, the Merovingians' bloodline was thought to carry a divine spark. The Grail, in this context, is both metaphor and reality, a representation of continuity, sanctity, and secret authority. It explains why the dynasty was viewed with suspicion by the Church, why chroniclers obscured their deeds, and why their bloodline became the subject of later speculation and intrigue. Protecting this sacred lineage became a matter of life and death, a struggle that extended beyond politics into the realm of cosmic order and destiny. Artifacts and symbols linked to the Merovingians suggest that the Grail's significance was more than myth. The recurring motifs of bees, serpents, and sacred relics, combined with rituals emphasizing blood and lineage, indicate that the dynasty maintained a deep awareness of their mystical heritage. They understood that power was not merely inherited through conquest or alliance, but through the careful preservation of a sacred essence. The Grail, in this sense, was a cipher, a way to communicate the extraordinary nature of the dynasty's blood, a symbol recognizable to initiates but incomprehensible to the uninitiated. Modern researchers and esoteric scholars have traced these threads across centuries, noting that the Merovingians' supposed guardianship of the Grail aligns with stories of secret societies, hidden knowledge, and royal mysteries. From the Templars to later European dynasties, echoes of this narrative persist, suggesting a continuity of belief that the Grail, or what it represents, must be protected. Whether literal or allegorical, the Grail functions as a bridge between myth and history, north and south, the human and the divine. In this way, the Merovingians' legacy extends far beyond their reign, resonating in the imagination, literature, and secret traditions of Europe for centuries. The Grail also reframes our understanding of the Merovingians' decline. Political historians often point to the rise of the Carolingians and internal strife as the reason for the dynasty's fall. But when viewed through the lens of sacred blood and hidden lineage, their decline takes on new dimensions. Perhaps the church and emerging powers sought not only to control territory, but to suppress a bloodline whose very existence challenged their monopoly on divine legitimacy. The obscuring of the Merovingian story may have been as much about erasing a sacred authority as it was about seizing political power. The allure of the Grail lies in its duality. It is both a tangible object of quest and an emblem of an invisible truth. For the Merovingians, it represented continuity, sacred inheritance, and the unbroken thread of a lineage that linked the mortal world with divine influence. By connecting their blood to this symbol, the dynasty asserted its exceptional status, crafting a narrative that transcended ordinary kingship. In doing so, they became more than rulers. They became custodians of a mystery that has fascinated generations, a mystery encoded in myth, ritual, and the subtle symbolism of sacred blood. In exploring the Grail in the context of the Merovingians, we see how myth, lineage, and power converge. The dynasty's bloodline was a vessel, carrying both authority and secrecy, shaping history in ways that remain hidden to this day. The Grail, far from being a simple cup or story, becomes a symbol of enduring mystery, a reminder that some legacies are too potent to die, surviving through whispers, allegory, and the unbroken flow of sacred blood. It is here, at the intersection of myth and history, that the Merovingians' true power and their most enduring secret can be glimpsed. Even as the Merovingians' political power waned under the rise of the Carolingians, their legend endured, and with it, the whispers of a bloodline that refused to die. The so-called Royce-Faineants, the do-nothing kings, were a carefully constructed narrative designed to diminish the dynasty's public authority. Yet beneath this facade, the sacred bloodline may have been quietly preserved, hidden from the prying eyes of rival powers. Stories suggest that the Merovingians understood the dangers posed by the church and new rulers and took measures to protect their lineage, ensuring that the mystical essence carried in their blood could survive, even if their thrones did not. The concept of hidden heirs was not merely legend, but a recurring motif in European history. Chronicles, while sparse and fragmentary, contain hints that younger sons, distant relatives, or secret descendants were moved to remote regions, cloaked in obscurity, or married strategically to maintain the purity of the line. These precautions were both practical and symbolic, preserving not only genetic continuity, but the sacred authority associated with it. The bloodline, it seems, was treated as a vessel of power, one that needed protection at all costs, shielded from those who would exploit or extinguish it. Legends place some Merovingian heirs in the shadowy reaches of northern Europe, particularly in regions connected to early Scandinavian and Frankish migrations. There, in forests, river valleys, and remote estates, the family may have maintained its traditions in secrecy. Rituals, symbols, and esoteric knowledge would have been passed from one generation to the next, quietly preserving the dynasty's spiritual and mystical identity. In this way, even when the kings no longer held formal power, their bloodline remained potent, safeguarded by those who understood its importance. Historical documents, though fragmented, provide tantalizing hints of these hidden heirs. Some texts speak of obscure nobles with unusual claims of ancestry, claiming rights or privileges long after the official Merovingian line had been displaced. These individuals, often deliberately obscured in records, may represent the continuation of the sacred bloodline in exile, a line that could re-emerge under favorable conditions, carrying with it the rituals, symbols, and hidden authority of its forebears. The deliberate vagueness of these records suggests an intentional strategy to survive without drawing attention, to preserve power in plain sight while remaining invisible to those who sought to destroy it. The survival of the Merovingian bloodline also finds echoes in legend and myth. Folktales describe kings or noble figures who vanish mysteriously, only to reappear in later generations under new names or in distant lands. These narratives, often dismissed as fantasy, may encode historical realities, the careful relocation and concealment of heirs to preserve the sacred lineage. In addition, secret societies and mystical orders that emerged in later centuries sometimes claim knowledge of this hidden heritage, perpetuating the idea that Merovingian blood continued to flow, protected by secrecy and ritual. Esoteric historians argue that these hidden heirs were not simply passive survivors, but active custodians of a legacy. They may have preserved rituals, sacred symbols, and knowledge associated with the dynasty, ensuring that the mystical authority of the Merovingians persisted beyond their political reign. The bloodline itself, therefore, became a living repository of both power and memory, a bridge between myth and history, northern heritage, and the evolving political landscape of medieval Europe. The secrecy surrounding the hidden Merovingians also reflects the broader context of European power struggles. Dynasties rose and fell, territories were conquered, and the church sought to consolidate authority. In such a climate, maintaining a sacred bloodline required discretion, cunning, and strategic foresight. By removing themselves from the public eye, hidden heirs could survive, waiting for a moment when their lineage might again exert influence, whether through politics, marriage, or the subtle assertion of spiritual authority. This preservation of the bloodline also reinforces the Merovingians' enduring mystique. Even as historians later wrote them off as ceremonial relics of a bygone era, the notion of hidden heirs persisted in folklore, esoteric texts, and secret traditions. The idea that the blood continues quietly in hidden branches speaks to a broader fascination with dynastic secrecy, the intersection of myth and genealogy, and the belief that some lines of power are too sacred to be fully erased. Ultimately, the hidden heirs of the Merovingians represent both survival and defiance. They embody a lineage that could not be extinguished by conquest, propaganda, or ecclesiastical authority. Their secrecy ensured that the dynasty's mystical legacy remained intact, waiting in the shadows, preserved through ritual, tradition, and careful guardianship. The story of the hidden Merovingians reminds us that power is not solely about crowns or armies. Sometimes it is about what persists unseen, a bloodline carrying knowledge, authority, and a sacred essence that transcends history itself. In the ancient lands of ice and fire, the bloodlines of myth still whisper through the stones. The North has always held stories that blend gods with men, kings with spirits, and mortals who bore the shimmer of something not entirely of this world. These tales, passed down through frost and flame, speak of a divine inheritance carried in the veins of rulers who walked between realms. And if one listens closely, beneath the poetic mist of Nordic sagas and the forgotten chants of Merovingian priests, one hears a familiar rhythm, the pulse of sacred lineage, echoing from Gaul to Scandinavia. In the frozen heart of the North, there was a belief that every royal line was touched by celestial fire. The Inglings traced their descent from Freyr, the god of fertility and light. The Volsungs from Odin himself. These were not metaphors to the ancient mind. They were truths carried in blood, proven by vision, prophecy, and the strange glow that clung to those destined to rule. The same luminous essence was said to course through the veins of the Merovingian kings. Chroniclers spoke of their long, golden hair as a mark of their holiness, a living halo. They were kings by divine right not because of conquest, but because their very blood sang of heaven. The Norse told the same stories under different names. They spoke of the white-blooded, those born of gods and men, carrying the light of the Aesir within. It was said their eyes reflected the northern lights, and their hearts carried the warmth of sacred fire. Both civilizations, the Franks and the Norse, built their royal myths around this same duality, the fire from above and the ice from below. The Merovingians were often associated with sacred waters, springs, and the serpent. In Scandinavia, the ancient myths spoke of Ymir, the first being born from melting ice and divine flame. From his blood, the world was formed, and from his body, the gods shaped creation. The concept of blood as both a physical and metaphysical substance ran deep through these traditions. To the ancients, blood was memory, the vessel of divine spark, the river that carried the soul's ancestry. The Old Norse poems described royal lines whose blood burned with star fire, a poetic mirror to the Merovingian legends of their luminous vitality. Both peoples saw in their rulers a bridge between heaven and earth, born of an ancient fusion between spirit and matter. And yet, as centuries passed, this understanding was buried beneath the political machinery of kingship. The sacred became secular, the mythic rationalized, but the symbols remained, reminders of a truth too powerful to die. The bee of the Merovingians, the serpent of wisdom, the spiral and triskelion of the Norse, all spoke of regeneration, rebirth, and the eternal cycle of divine essence descending into human flesh. These motifs represented more than dynastic pride. They were the secret geometry of power itself. The rulers who bore them were not merely kings, but embodiments of cosmic balance, the living alchemy of ice and fire. In many of the old Scandinavian myths, one finds tales of beings who could not die in the ordinary sense. They would fall in battle, only to return in another age, reborn under different names, carrying fragments of memory from their former lives. The Merovingians, too, were believed to possess a similar mystery. Medieval texts describe their uncanny resilience, their blood never wholly spilled, and their seed never extinguished. Some scholars interpret these tales as poetic exaggerations. Others, more daringly, see in them an encoded remembrance of genetic continuity, the deliberate preservation of an ancient bloodline through ritual union and secrecy. The marriage customs of early Frankish and Norse kings were designed not for romance, but for purity of essence, ensuring that the sacred spark did not fade. The imagery of ice and fire captures this duality perfectly. Ice, cold, still, eternal, represents preservation, the memory of the divine stored in form. Fire, volatile, luminous, consuming, represents awakening, the divine consciousness that transforms and renews. Together, they create life, and in the myths of both North and West, this was the origin of kingship itself. The world was born from their meeting, and so too were the rulers meant to maintain that cosmic harmony. In the chill of the Scandinavian night, storytellers spoke of the sons of flame and frost, rulers whose very presence balanced the elements of existence. The Merovingians' sacred marriages, often between divine lineages and human houses, echoed this same principle. Their claim to kingship was not inherited by birthright alone, but by embodying the cosmic union of opposing forces. Archaeologists have often uncovered in both regions relics that seem to testify to a shared spiritual vocabulary. Sun wheels found in Frankish tombs, resemble the solar symbols of Norse stone carvings. The serpent motifs in Merovingian jewelry echo the Midgard serpent coiling around the world tree. And the recurring imagery of golden hair, radiant, divine, and untouchable, appears in both Merovingian portraits and Norse poetry. These are not coincidences. They are traces of a once unified spiritual code, a worldview in which royal bloodlines were seen as living vessels of celestial harmony. Some researchers suggest that this symbolic correspondence hints at a far older connection, perhaps to a forgotten civilization that predated both Gaul and Scandinavia, where the union of light and matter was first ritualized in human form. This idea is strengthened by the recurring myth of the first king, the original ruler born from divine fire and primordial ice. In the Norse Edda, that king was Odin's ancestor. In the Gallo-Roman traditions that influenced the Franks, that figure took other names, sometimes Nimrod, sometimes a fallen angel, sometimes a god-king who descended from the stars. The Merovingian chroniclers cloaked this mystery in Christian language, but the underlying pattern remained. Their dynasty claimed descent from a being who was neither fully human nor fully divine, one who united the realms above and below. When seen through this lens, the Merovingian kings were not the beginning of something new, but the continuation of something ancient, stretching back into the mythic dawn. Even the landscapes of the two regions echo the same mythic structure. The fjords and forests of Scandinavia, the sacred groves and stone circles of Gaul, all were seen as liminal spaces where the world of men met the world of spirits. Both cultures held that certain mountains, rivers, and groves were guarded by the ancestors of kings, waiting for the right blood to awaken them again. The old texts speak of the sleepers, royal spirits entombed in ice or hidden beneath sacred springs, their return heralded by signs in the sky. Comets, northern lights, strange stars. The same imagery surrounds the Merovingians, whose last king, Dagobert II, was said to sleep in a secret place, awaiting the dawn of a new age. The legends merge, frozen kings beneath the northern snows, golden-haired princes awaiting the return of divine fire. The myth of the eternal king is perhaps the clearest meeting point of the two traditions. The Norse had Baldur, the pure, radiant god whose death brought on winter and whose rebirth would restore the world. The Franks had Dagobert, the golden king whose fall marked the end of sacred rule. Both were betrayed, both fell, both promised to return when the world was ready to remember its divine heritage. Beneath these stories lies a shared archetype, the sleeping bloodline, the luminous king who never truly dies, for his spirit flows through generations. The same myth that inspired the Merovingian Fisher King and the Norse Last Hero reveals an ancient longing for reunion with the divine. In the end, the bloodlines of ice and fire are not just biological inheritances. They're symbols of a deeper human mystery, the yearning to bridge heaven and earth, to embody the eternal in the temporal, the divine in the mortal. Whether one calls it the Grail, the serpent, or the flame, it points to the same truth, that within human blood lies a spark of something far older than history, something that once ruled the North and the West alike. The Merovingians guarded this knowledge in secret. The Norse sang it in sagas around the fire. Two cultures, two climates, one hidden truth, that the royal line was never just of flesh and blood, but of spirit and star. And perhaps, as the wind whispers across the northern plains and the snow glows faintly under the aurora's light, that bloodline still remembers itself, sleeping, waiting, glowing faintly beneath the skin of time, where ice meets fire and kings are born once more. The rise of Christianity across Europe marked not only a spiritual transformation, but also a deliberate reshaping of history itself. In the early centuries of the Church, the pagan traditions of the North and the sacred bloodlines of old kings became inconvenient truths, dangerous to the authority of the new religious order. Priests and bishops, tasked with consolidating spiritual and temporal power, sought to replace the memory of divine lineage with doctrines that emphasized obedience over innate sanctity. The Merovingians, whose very existence seemed to straddle the boundary between human and celestial, were a particular concern. Their stories of luminous hair, miraculous births, and sacred blood could not be allowed to persist in their unaltered form, for they hinted at a source of authority older than the Church itself, one that suggested kingship could be inherited not through papal approval or conquest, but through divine essence. In Gaul, Christian chroniclers took great care to sanitize the history of the Merovingian dynasty. Heroes were transformed into cautionary tales. Holy kings became flawed mortals, and the divine spark in their blood was replaced with mortal piety or sin. Yet, the old stories refused to vanish entirely. Beneath the surface of official history, whispers persisted of secret ceremonies, hidden relics, and children born under auspicious stars who carried the old blood. Some records were deliberately obscured, hidden in monasteries or cloisters, while others were encoded in obscure Latin phrasing that only the initiated could decipher. The suppression was not always overt. It was often subtle, a careful redirection of narrative, a masking of symbols, a reimagining of divine kingship as myth rather than reality. Still, the truth, encoded in rituals and artifacts, continued to survive, waiting for those patient enough to read between the lines. In Scandinavia, the story unfolded differently, but with a similar intent. As Christianity spread northward, the Old Norse kings and their sacred lineages were rebranded as folklore. The divine ancestry of rulers, once celebrated in sagas and inscribed on rune stones, was now relegated to legend, myth, and fairy tale. The Norse priesthoods, known as the cedar practitioners, had long maintained the sacred knowledge of these bloodlines, knowledge that could not be allowed to merge with the Christian narrative. As the new faith took hold, these priests either disappeared into secrecy or adapted, embedding their traditions in allegory and ritual that would survive for centuries in a hidden, encoded form. Symbols of power, the serpent, the sun wheel, the Vaknut, remained in plain sight, but their meaning shifted, becoming decorative or mystical rather than genealogical. And yet, for those who knew how to read them, the secrets of divine descent remained alive, quietly enduring beneath the veneer of religious conformity. This era also saw a transformation in how the sacred bloodlines were treated physically. Burial practices changed, and tombs that once celebrated divine kingship were stripped of their symbols, moved, or destroyed. Monasteries became the new custodians of memory, and within their stone walls, relics of kings, fragments of sacred texts, and genealogical scrolls were carefully preserved, often in secret. In some instances, entire lineages were deliberately obscured. The children of certain rulers were removed from records, their identities masked by centuries of obfuscation. But the old priests and chroniclers knew the truth. The bloodlines endured, preserved in secret. Their continuity was guarded, not merely as a matter of family pride, but as a matter of cosmic significance, for the rulers of old were thought to embody the very essence of divine order, a living bridge between heaven and earth. The tension between suppression and preservation is central to understanding the survival of these sacred lines. Christianity did not erase them completely. It forced them into hiding. The stories of the Merovingians, of Dagobert II, of the northern kings, became fragmented, scattered across monasteries, oral traditions, and coded inscriptions. Some symbols survived only as the subtle fleur-de-lis carved into stones, as enigmatic lines in a chant, or as mystical motifs in royal regalia. The Church's efforts, no matter how thorough, could not eliminate centuries of sacred tradition embedded in blood, song, and ritual. The divine ancestry of kings became a secret society of memory, a hidden web of knowledge that waited for the eyes that could see and the hearts that could remember. It is within this shadowed history that one begins to see the interplay of fear, reverence, and secrecy. The church feared the old bloodlines because they represented a truth too powerful, a legitimacy that predated any bishop's consecration. Yet the people, particularly in rural and northern regions, continued to revere these sacred lineages, sometimes in disguised forms, in tales told by firesides, in obscure festivals, in secret rites timed to the solstice or equinox. This duality created a fascinating tension. The sacred bloodlines were at once condemned and venerated, erased and remembered, visible only to those who knew where to look. Even in exile or obscurity, the essence of divine kingship persisted, encoded into rituals, symbols, and hidden texts that would one day hint at a continuity stretching back through the mists of time. The Merovingians themselves became both victims and guardians of this hidden history. Forced into semi-obscurity, they were compelled to protect their lineage with secrecy, ensuring that no one could fully claim or extinguish their sacred inheritance. They moved quietly through the shadows of medieval Europe, finding refuge in distant lands, forming alliances, and occasionally reasserting themselves when conditions allowed. Their bloodline, though suppressed in official chronicles, survived because its significance transcended ordinary human concerns. It was a living expression of cosmic order, a vessel for divine memory, and a legacy that could not be fully erased. Even today, echoes of this suppressed lineage remain. Hidden manuscripts, cryptic carvings, and genealogical mysteries trace the Merovingian bloodline northward, into regions where Christianity had once sought to assert total control. The sacred line persists in fragments, whispering its story to those who listen closely, reminding us that history is not merely what is written in official texts, but also what is remembered, hidden, and preserved in the silent corners of faith, devotion, and blood. Beneath the frozen soil of Northern Europe lie secrets that history often chooses to forget. In the quiet stillness of burial mounds, long-forgotten crypts, and hidden chambers, archaeologists have begun to uncover traces of a past that challenges conventional timelines. These are not the grand castles or cathedrals celebrated in textbooks, but subtle, enigmatic markers, artifacts that speak of journeys, connections, and bloodlines far older and more mysterious than previously acknowledged. Coins of Mediterranean origin found deep in Scandinavian earth, jewelry inscribed with symbols resembling those of the Merovingian dynasty, and even Christian artifacts dating centuries before official conversion hint at an intricate network of migration and cultural transmission. Each discovery whispers a tantalizing suggestion that the sacred bloodlines of the Franks may have continued, quietly, beyond the reach of the written record, interweaving with the emerging royal houses of the north. Excavations reveal more than just material culture. Burial practices, carefully preserved, tell their own story. Some tombs contain skeletons positioned with a deliberate alignment to celestial bodies, a practice long associated with the Merovingians. Others reveal unique offerings, golden torques, rare amulets, and intricately carved ritual objects that seem to carry both symbolic and genealogical significance. The distribution of these artifacts, often far from any known Frankish settlement, challenges scholars to consider the possibility of a northern refuge, a hidden network where sacred lineage could survive in safety. It is in these silent graves that one begins to trace the faint echo of a bloodline that had once ruled Gaul, now quietly taking root among the fjords, forests, and rivers of Scandinavia. The clues extend beyond the material into the intangible. Folklore, sagas, and oral traditions, preserved in the harsh climates of the north, often align uncannily with what has been found in the soil. Tales of kings arriving mysteriously from distant lands, of golden-haired princes descending from the south, and of sacred objects carried across seas all point toward a continuity that the mainstream historical record has largely ignored. DNA evidence, though limited and often controversial, hints at anomalies among certain Scandinavian lineages, traits and markers that do not align neatly with local populations, but suggest distant southern origins. Each fragment of evidence, each whispered legend, forms a mosaic that gradually unveils a hidden truth, that the North was not a cultural vacuum waiting to be filled, but a sanctuary where a sacred bloodline might endure, quietly preserved across generations. This hidden continuity is further reinforced by the alignment of certain archaeological sites with astronomical events. Burial mounds and sacred stones often correspond to solstices, equinoxes, and the movement of the stars, echoing the celestial associations attributed to the Merovingians. Such practices suggest not merely a reverence for the cosmos, but a deliberate preservation of ancient ritual knowledge. The placement of artifacts, the orientation of graves, and the symbols carved into stone all hint at an understanding of divine order transmitted across centuries. These northern custodians of sacred knowledge may have been carrying forward a tradition that intertwined blood, ritual, and cosmic significance, ensuring that the essence of the lineage survived even as its political influence waned. Some historians argue that these findings are coincidental, that trade and migration alone can explain the presence of Mediterranean artifacts in Scandinavian soil. Yet when combined with the oral traditions, subtle iconographic similarities, and occasional genealogical anomalies, a compelling narrative emerges, one in which the Merovingian bloodline did not end with Dagobert II, but found refuge and renewal among the northern peoples. The convergence of archaeology, legend, and early medieval history suggests that the sacred kings of Gaul were not fully erased, but transformed, adapting to a new land while preserving the essence of their identity. The icy fjords and dense forests of Scandinavia became both a physical and symbolic sanctuary, a place where the sacred could endure, protected from the encroaching tide of political and religious reform. Modern explorers of this hidden history have begun to follow these threads with increasing fascination. Remote mounds, ancient rune stones, and isolated monasteries are studied not merely for their aesthetic or cultural value, but as repositories of secret knowledge. Some sites, long overlooked by mainstream archaeology, have revealed patterns of settlement and ritual that strongly suggest deliberate preservation of sacred lineage. Objects that once seemed mundane, a ring, a sword hilt, or a fragment of cloth, acquire new meaning when viewed in this context, acting as markers of a continuity carefully hidden in plain sight. Even the simplest artifacts can tell stories of migration, alliance, and the deliberate safeguarding of a bloodline that was always meant to survive, even under the cover of secrecy. The deeper one delves into these northern traces, the more the narrative shifts from mere speculation to a haunting possibility. Scandinavia, with its remote landscapes and harsh climates, provided both concealment and preservation. It allowed a sacred tradition to continue largely untouched by the political and ecclesiastical upheavals of continental Europe. The Merovingian bloodline, shrouded in mystery, may have taken root here in ways that were never documented, leaving only subtle hints: a piece of jewelry, a ceremonial burial, a story told in hushed tones. These fragments, when pieced together, reveal a hidden map of continuity that stretches across centuries, bridging the lands of the Franks with the fjords and forests of the north. They invite us to imagine a lineage that was never truly lost, but quietly carried forward by those who understood its importance, awaiting the rediscovery that would one day awaken its story to the world once more. The legend of the blue blood has long captivated the imagination of those who study royal lineages, blending biology, myth, and mysticism into a story that transcends ordinary history. In the context of the Merovingians, the term takes on a particularly intriguing significance. To medieval chroniclers and later esoteric writers, blue blood was not merely a poetic metaphor for nobility. It was a symbol of a lineage infused with a kind of sacred vitality. The Merovingians were often described as having hair of radiant gold, skin so pale that the veins appeared blue beneath it, and a luminous presence that set them apart from ordinary mortals. These physical characteristics were considered outward signs of their divine inheritance, markers of a bloodline thought to carry a spiritual as well as a genetic distinction. But the story of the blue blood is not limited to appearance alone. It is deeply intertwined with the notion of cosmic lineage, a bloodline touched by the heavens and preserved through careful marriages, ritual, and secrecy. Across Scandinavia, similar ideas appear in poetic form. Ancient Norse sagas describe sky-blooded kings, rulers whose very essence reflected the stars and the northern lights. These kings were said to possess extraordinary traits, wisdom, strength, and a subtle inner glow, which distinguished them from ordinary men. Their veins, like those of the Merovingians, were thought to carry the echo of the divine, a living connection between heaven and earth. In both traditions, blood is more than a biological substance. It is memory, power, and spiritual inheritance all at once. It links the past to the present, the mortal to the divine, and the human ruler to cosmic order. To the ancients, those who carried such blood were not rulers by chance, but by destiny. Their very essence assigned that they were chosen to guide, protect, and preserve the sacred balance. The concept of blue blood also intersects with science, though in ways that remain speculative. Modern genetic studies reveal anomalies in certain lineages that may suggest distant origins or rare traits preserved through selective unions. The medieval preoccupation with blood purity, far from being mere superstition, could reflect an early understanding of hereditary uniqueness, a conscious effort to preserve traits deemed sacred. In this light, the myths of Merovingian luminescence and Norse skyblood may have a biological underpinning, reinforced by ritual, symbolism, and careful genealogical planning. Blood becomes both metaphor and material reality, a vessel for a lineage consciously safeguarded across centuries. Such preservation ensured that the essence of divine kingship, whether expressed as moral authority, spiritual insight, or genetic distinctiveness, remained intact despite political upheavals, exile, and conquest. Ancient rituals further illustrate the sacred significance of this blood. Among the Merovingians, coronation ceremonies were not merely political formalities, but acts of cosmic alignment, designed to imbue the ruler with divine energy and to recognize their inherent sacredness. Oils, anointed waters, and ceremonial garments all played a role in marking the king as a living conduit of celestial power. Similarly, Scandinavian rites often emphasize the king's connection to the natural and spiritual worlds. Kings were bathed in sacred waters, crowned under the open sky, and symbolically united with deities through ceremonial acts. These rituals served as both recognition and reinforcement of the bloodline's special nature, ensuring that its sacred qualities were publicly acknowledged while remaining shrouded in mystery, accessible only to those versed in its meaning. The imagery associated with blue blood extends into symbolism, artifacts, and art. In Merovingian tombs, stylized bees, serpents, and solar motifs appear alongside depictions of rulers, suggesting a coded language in which blood, light, and divinity were intertwined. In Scandinavian carvings and rune stones, similar motifs appear. Serpentine forms, solar discs, and luminous figures hinting at the extraordinary nature of those they commemorate. These symbols act as markers of lineage, hidden signposts for those who understood their meaning. They are reminders that the sacred essence of kingship is not always visible in plain sight. It requires knowledge, interpretation, and sometimes initiation into a tradition passed down through centuries. Even the oral traditions preserve the idea of blood as sacred memory. Tales of kings who could heal, foresee, or inspire extraordinary loyalty emphasize the potency of the lineage rather than the deeds alone. These stories, whether from the forests of Scandinavia or the plains of Gaul, share a common thread. Blood is power. Blood is destiny. Blood is knowledge carried from one generation to the next. In these narratives, the blue-veined ruler is more than a symbol of nobility. They're a living testament to the endurance of divine essence, a bridge between the mortal realm and the cosmos, a reminder that the sacred can endure even in exile or obscurity. The modern fascination with blue blood continues, fueled by genealogical research, historical mysteries, and the allure of hidden knowledge. Researchers uncover unexpected connections between ancient families, trace lineages across continents, and speculate about the survival of traits once deemed sacred. The idea that some bloodlines carry a hidden inheritance, a spark of something beyond the ordinary, resonates as much today as it did a millennium ago. For the Merovingians and their northern counterparts, blue blood is not merely a curiosity. It is the embodiment of continuity, secrecy, and the quiet power that preserves a legacy through time. It is both literal and symbolic, a reminder that history is often written in subtle lines, in veins, in rituals, in the quiet endurance of those chosen by fate, guided by the stars, and protected by the sanctity of their blood. Ultimately, the secret of the blue blood is a meditation on the nature of inheritance itself. It is the convergence of myth, biology, and ritual into a single thread of continuity stretching across centuries. It teaches that power is not always visible, that sacredness is not always proclaimed, and that some truths survive only through careful guardianship, whispered stories, and the patience of those who know how to preserve them. In the veins of the Merovingians and their Scandinavian descendants, one glimpses a living link to a past that refuses to die, a reminder that lineage, in its deepest sense, is more than family. It is the vessel of memory, destiny, and perhaps even the divine itself. The connection between the Franks and the Norse emerges as a hidden bridge of esoteric knowledge, trade, and migration, one that mainstream history has rarely acknowledged. The story begins not with conquest, but with subtle exchanges, a coin carried across the sea, a marriage alliance whispered in secrecy, a ritual object moved from one land to another. These threads suggest a continuity that is at once physical and spiritual, linking the Merovingian bloodline with the emerging rulers of Scandinavia. As the Carolingian Empire began to rise, the remnants of sacred Frankish lineages did not vanish entirely. Instead, they traveled northward, seeking refuge and influence in lands that were wild, cold, and comparatively unconquered. Here, among fjords and forests, they could maintain their traditions, transmit their sacred knowledge, and quietly embed their presence into the royal structures of the north. Trade routes played an essential role in this hidden network, carrying more than goods. The Norse were avid sailors and traders, journeying from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, bringing with them artifacts, symbols, and, occasionally, families of influence. Some of these voyagers are believed to have carried Merovingian heritage, either through bloodlines or through those initiated into the sacred rituals of the Franks. Jewelry bearing Merovingian motifs has been found in Scandinavian settlements, and the faint traces of Latin inscriptions appear alongside runes, hinting at a shared symbolic language. The coins, the torques, the amulets, all act as tangible evidence of this quiet transmission of power and knowledge, suggesting a deliberate strategy to maintain the sanctity of the bloodline even in exile. Marriage and alliance were equally vital. In a world where divine kingship was sacred, Unions were carefully arranged to preserve lineage and ensure the survival of spiritual inheritance. Merovingian families may have formed discreet alliances with northern chieftains, embedding their sacred blood into Scandinavian dynasties. Over generations, this interweaving created a lineage that was both northern and southern, pagan and Christian, visible and hidden. In sagas and oral traditions, these unions are often recast as myth. A golden-haired stranger arrives, marries a local queen, and gives rise to a line of rulers with extraordinary gifts. These tales, poetic as they may be, carry the imprint of real historical processes, the deliberate integration of bloodlines to preserve sacred inheritance. The symbols that traveled along these invisible bridges offer further clues. The bee, the serpent, the fleur-de-lis, and various solar motifs all appear across both Frankish and Scandinavian artifacts, from jewelry to carvings to ceremonial objects. Such correspondences are too consistent to be coincidental. They suggest an esoteric understanding, a symbolic code shared across regions that carried both lineage and meaning. For the Merovingians, these symbols encoded divine heritage. For the northern kings, they reinforced legitimacy and cosmic alignment. When placed in the context of sacred kingship, the artifacts become not mere decoration, but keys to understanding a continuity of spiritual authority across distance, culture, and time. Oral traditions also preserve fragments of this connection. Scandinavian sagas speak of rulers arriving mysteriously from distant lands, bearing gifts, knowledge, and a strange aura of power. The stories describe leaders whose wisdom and presence seemed otherworldly, who possessed skills and insight beyond local knowledge. It is tempting to dismiss these tales as legend, but when combined with archaeological evidence, they form a pattern suggesting that Merovingian influence extended far beyond the borders of Gaul. The north, with its dense forests and secluded valleys, offered the perfect sanctuary for such sacred lineages to thrive, undisturbed by the machinations of empires or the dictates of the church. The esoteric continuity is further reinforced by ritual practices that endured in northern courts. Solstice ceremonies, the alignment of burial mounds with celestial events, and the persistence of runic symbols echo the cosmological traditions of the Merovingians. These northern practices did not arise in isolation. They reflect the integration of knowledge brought by southern bloodlines and adapted to local culture. By encoding sacred lineage into ritual, kingship, and symbol, the Merovingian influence became subtle, almost invisible, yet enduring. This continuity demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of both secrecy and preservation, ensuring that the bloodline could survive without overtly revealing itself to the world. In addition, some Scandinavian artifacts display inscriptions and iconography that seem to merge pagan and Christian elements in ways reminiscent of Merovingian syncretism. Crosses intertwined with solar discs, serpentine forms surrounding runes, and depictions of radiant rulers suggest a deliberate blending of traditions, preserving sacred knowledge while adapting to shifting religious landscapes. These hybrid symbols hint at a deep awareness of both spiritual and political necessity. Sacred bloodlines could survive only if they were flexible, hidden, and encoded into the culture of their adopted land. Over time, the convergence of Frankish and Norse traditions produced a subtle but enduring network of influence. Sacred bloodlines, cosmic knowledge, and ritual practices persisted in Scandinavia, quietly shaping the emerging structures of power. The northern kings, often depicted in sagas as heirs of divine or semi-divine ancestry, may have carried within them the echoes of Merovingian essence, preserved through centuries of careful guardianship. This secret bridge, woven from blood, trade, ritual, and symbolism, connected Gaul and Scandinavia in ways that mainstream history has largely overlooked, leaving behind only traces and artifacts, myths, and the faint memory of sacred kingship. Ultimately, the story of the esoteric bridge between Franks and Vikings reveals a sophisticated strategy of survival. Sacred knowledge and lineage were too valuable to be destroyed, too potent to be left to chance. By migrating, marrying, and embedding their influence in northern courts, Merovingian descendants ensured that their essence endured. This quiet migration of blood, symbol, and ritual created a hidden tapestry linking the ancient rulers of Gaul with the royal houses of Scandinavia, a continuity that transcended conquest, religion, and the passage of centuries. It is a story of preservation, adaptation, and subtle power, a secret history written not in chronicles, but in blood, stone, and the enduring memory of those who knew how to protect the sacred flame. The question of the last descendants of the Merovingians carries with it a sense of both fascination and unease. For centuries, scholars and mystics alike have speculated about whether the sacred bloodline truly vanished with the fall of Dagobert II, or whether it endured quietly, hidden in plain sight among northern lands. The story of these descendants is not one of grand castles or public pageantry, but of secrecy, subtlety, and survival. Whispers of noble houses with mysterious origins, genealogical gaps, and unusual rituals suggest that the Merovingian legacy may have persisted far beyond the boundaries of historical record. These families, whether through conscious preservation or mere circumstance, became the custodians of an inheritance that was as spiritual as it was genetic, tasked with safeguarding a lineage that carried echoes of divine authority. In many regions of northern Europe, particularly in areas of Scandinavia and the Pyrenees, traditions speak of families claiming descent from kings who were long thought lost to history. Some lineages are traceable only through obscure records, hidden in monastic archives, or encoded in the margins of religious texts. Others appear in oral tradition, their stories passed down through generations in hushed tones, often disguised in mythic language to avoid the scrutiny of church authorities or rival rulers. These descendants were careful, deliberate, and extraordinarily patient, understanding that their blood carried more than a claim to temporal power. It embodied a sacred continuity that connected the human with the divine. The subtle markers of this lineage can be found in symbols, rituals, and cultural memory. Certain families maintained traditions that appeared mundane to outsiders, specific feast days, peculiar burial rites, or ceremonial garments. Yet these practices often concealed meanings tied to the preservation of the sacred blood. For instance, some noble houses preserved heirlooms that bore Merovingian motifs, bees, serpents, and fleur-de-lis designs, often hidden within jewelry, tapestries, or regalia. These objects acted as talismans and reminders of their origins, signaling a continuity of spiritual authority that remained invisible to the wider world. Even architecture and heraldry were sometimes encoded with subtle references to divine descent, a silent language understood only by those initiated into the secret knowledge. Genetic studies, though limited and often inconclusive, have hinted at anomalies among certain European lineages that do not align with expected regional ancestry. While modern science cannot yet fully trace or verify these claims, the possibility that ancient Merovingian blood survived in northern or isolated families cannot be entirely dismissed. The accounts of chroniclers, genealogical researchers, and mystics converge to suggest that some individuals, knowingly or unknowingly, continued to carry the sacred essence of this divine lineage. In folklore, these descendants were often endowed with extraordinary qualities, wisdom, charisma, or a peculiar presence that set them apart from others. These traits, though expressed subtly, were seen as markers of a heritage that had survived centuries of upheaval and suppression. Many of these families operated in the shadows of European history, influencing events quietly rather than asserting overt rule. Some became advisors to kings, guardians of sacred relics, or patrons of monastic orders where knowledge of the old bloodlines was preserved. Others integrated themselves into northern courts, contributing to cultural and spiritual life while maintaining the secrecy of their heritage. This careful stewardship ensured that the essence of the Merovingian bloodline remained intact, protected from external forces that might have sought to erase it completely. The legacy, in essence, became a hidden network, a subtle current flowing beneath the surface of medieval and early modern Europe. Oral traditions further reinforced the notion of survival. Stories passed down in remote valleys, among northern communities, often speak of mysterious visitors, golden-haired strangers, or enigmatic rulers whose presence seemed otherworldly. These narratives, poetic in nature, carry coded references to lineage and sacred inheritance, echoing motifs found in Merovingian chronicles and early Norse sagas. Even when stripped of historical detail, the symbolic continuity remains, a testament to the careful preservation of a bloodline that was never meant to be forgotten. In many ways, these descendants became living bridges between past and present, embodying the ancient ideals of kingship, divine favor, and cosmic order. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the Merovingian bloodline had become almost entirely invisible to mainstream history, yet it persisted through the quiet vigilance of a few chosen families. Their existence challenges conventional narratives, suggesting that sacred heritage can endure without recognition, influence history without visibility, and survive through secrecy rather than public power. These descendants remind us that lineage is not simply a matter of record or title, but of essence, a subtle transmission of sacred continuity across generations, preserved in blood, memory, and ritual. Ultimately, the story of the last descendants is both mystical and deeply human. It reflects a profound understanding of responsibility, the weight of legacy, and the patience required to safeguard what is precious and fragile. The Merovingians, who once ruled with luminous authority, may no longer occupy thrones, yet their essence persists, sleeping in the veins of those who bear the secret memory of divine kingship. These individuals, hidden yet enduring, serve as living proof that sacred bloodlines, when carefully protected, can transcend history, politics, and time itself. The flame of the Merovingian line, though often concealed, continues to glow faintly, a reminder that some legacies are too powerful, too sacred, to ever be fully extinguished. The story of the Merovingian bloodline reaches its climactic revelation in the alignment of kingship with the cosmos, a secret known to few and preserved across centuries. Beneath the swirling auroras of the north, in the quiet forests and fjords of Scandinavia, the descendants of sacred lineages once practiced rites that were as much about the heavens as they were about the earth. The North Star, Polaris, stood as a constant in the night sky, a celestial marker, unchanging and eternal, guiding travelers, sailors, and kings alike. For the custodians of divine blood, Polaris was more than a navigational point. It was a symbol, a cosmic emblem linking their lineage to the heavens. The Merovingians themselves, whose blood was said to carry the light of divinity, were intimately connected to such celestial symbolism. Their rituals, their art, and their very conception of kingship intertwined with the stars, suggesting that their authority was both terrestrial and cosmic, earthly and divine. The connection to the North Star becomes particularly striking when examining Scandinavian royal practices. Early Norse kings were often inaugurated in ceremonies designed to align them with celestial bodies, sometimes on nights when Polaris shone brightest. Sacred stones and burial mounds were positioned in accordance with stellar patterns, suggesting an esoteric understanding of astronomy as a reflection of divine order. The rituals were not mere superstition. They encoded a belief that rulers of sacred blood were conduits for cosmic harmony. To inherit the bloodline was to inherit a link to the stars themselves, a lineage aligned with the unchanging light that guided the night. In this sense, the sacred blood of the Merovingians was not simply human. It was a living thread connecting heaven and earth, ensuring that divine order persisted through generations. Artifacts found in both France and Scandinavia reinforce this celestial connection. Jewelry, ceremonial swords, and regalia often incorporate symbols of light, star patterns, and solar motifs, echoing the cosmic significance attributed to royal blood. The bee, the serpent, and the fleur-de-lis, emblematic of Merovingian dynastic power, appear alongside symbols of Polaris and celestial bodies in northern relics. These motifs suggest a continuity of esoteric knowledge, transmitted quietly from south to north, from Gaul to the fjords, across centuries. Each object, each carving, acts as a map of sacred alignment, a reminder that kingship was not merely political but a sacred vocation, a role designed to maintain harmony between the human and the divine, the temporal and the eternal. The celestial alignment also manifests in myth and ritual. Norse sagas speak of rulers whose destinies were written in the stars, whose fates were guided by the unchanging light of the heavens. The Merovingian chronicles, though cloaked in Christian interpretation, tell similar stories of kings chosen at birth, marked by luminous hair and divine presence, whose very essence resonated with the cosmic order. The parallels are uncanny. In both traditions, sacred kingship is a manifestation of celestial truth, a living embodiment of the universe's rhythms and cycles. To rule was not merely to govern people. It was to uphold balance, to act as the nexus between earth and sky, blood and star, mortality and divinity. Some scholars speculate that these celestial alignments may have had practical as well as symbolic implications. Knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and the timing of rituals allowed rulers to coordinate ceremonies with celestial events, reinforcing their sacred authority. By positioning mounds, temples, and burial sites in alignment with the stars, they encoded an enduring reminder of cosmic order into the landscape itself. Every ritual, every ceremony, became a reflection of a divine architecture, and the bloodlines that carried these traditions were seen as vital conduits, essential to maintaining the harmony between human civilization and the cosmos. The narrative of Polaris and sacred kingship reaches its apex in the convergence of blood, ritual, and cosmic awareness. The Merovingian descendants, who may have migrated north and integrated with Scandinavian royalty, inherited more than a name or a title. They inherited a role, a responsibility to maintain sacred order through presence, action, and alignment with the heavens. The stories of Dagobert II and other luminous rulers suggest that this alignment was not symbolic alone. It was a living reality, reflected in the reverence of subjects, the precision of ritual, and the subtle markings in art and architecture. The North became a sanctuary where the line of sacred kings could continue to exist, quietly embodying the celestial principles once celebrated in Gaul. Even today, the notion resonates with a quiet power. The North Star, constant and unmoving, reminds us of the enduring nature of sacred authority, of lineages that persist even when hidden from sight. The Merovingian bloodline, aligned with cosmic principles, exemplifies a legacy that transcends time, geography, and political upheaval. Their existence was not merely historical, but metaphysical, suggesting that true kingship is as much about alignment with universal truth as it is about earthly rule. The descendants, whether known or hidden, carry within them the memory of this alignment, a lineage that bridges centuries, cultures, and the boundary between human and divine. In the end, the revelation is both breathtaking and humbling. The sacred bloodline was never just about genealogy, nor solely about earthly power. It was a living testament to the marriage of human essence and cosmic design. To inherit the blood was to inherit a connection to the eternal, to a light that guides silently yet unwaveringly. Polaris, the unchanging star, becomes more than a navigational point. It is a symbol of the enduring flame of the Merovingian lineage, a reminder that the sacred can endure, even in exile, even in obscurity, and that the true measure of kingship lies in the alignment of blood, duty, and the eternal sky.